everyone.
Welcome, everyone, to our November Neurohumanities Network meeting. As a reminder, we are a group of neurologists and trainees who are interested in this intersection between the arts, the humanities, and neuroscience. We are also fortunate to have the support of the Arts and Humanities Initiative at Harvard Medical School. And we also want to tell you a little bit about how you can stay connected with us. So as you know, we have monthly virtual seminars. We also have some booster sessions that you'll hear a little bit more about. We also have a YouTube channel that really serves as our lecture archive. We have social media via X, Instagram, Blue Sky, and LinkedIn. So stay in touch with us. We have a newsletter, and you can get the QR code to subscribe to the newsletter here. We also have an incredible website that our team put together. So I definitely encourage you to go to the website. But now I want to tell you a little bit about the talk today. So this is very special to me for two reasons. Number one, it's given by one of my favorite people in the world and a key mentor of mine, Dr. Federico Rodriguez-Porcel, who is a dual trained movement disorder and cognitive specialist. He obtained this fellowship training when he was in Cincinnati. He has since moved to the Medical University of South Carolina, where he's everyone's favorite attending and also leads an aphasia clinic. And the other reason why this is such an important talk to me is that he'll be talking about one of, I think I can say, our favorite authors, Jorge Luis Borges, who's just an incredible Argentine writer of short stories and really a founder of magical realism. And today, Federico will tell us about how we can navigate the limits and opportunities of language through the writings of Jorge Luis Borges. So without further ado, Dr. Rodriguez-Porcel, take it away.
Thank you, Mattia, for that kind introduction. Let me see. Let me see if I share this. Okay. Guess you guys can see it. Okay.
Yeah, we can see.
So again, thank you so much for the invitation and encouragement. I think that's something that when you have trainees that find things that you find interesting, also interesting, that's always encouraging and motivates you to keep going. And I thank you all of you who joined today. I was telling Mattia and Galina that I'm both excited about this and anxious. Excited because this is something I can't believe I'm giving this talk. Is about topics that I love and I find myself thinking about them frequently and being able to discuss them and having the opportunity to take the time and try to put something together to share with someone else has been an amazing experience. So I already won from this experience. I hope that I can transmit something helpful to you, which is what it makes me anxious because I'm sure that I'm not going to be able to do this topic a service. I'm going to probably do a disservice, but because there's so much we can talk about. And I'm a clinician. I'm not a linguist. I'm not a literary critic, but I hope that I can share with you some of the things that I found interesting throughout this reading of these topics that have been going through my mind for a number of years now. So let's get started. Let me see. So this is an outline and things that we're going to talk about is about the potential of language, think about language as a tool, and what is it? And I want you to think about it. What do you think language is for, right? Is it to describe reality, what we see in the world, ourselves, for communicating, for thinking? And how is language able to achieve this? And I think very appropriately, I chose to put one of the titles of Borges, The Garden of Forking Paths, because this is not going to be linear. This is going to go like all around and come back. So in a very Borges type of way. So yeah, we'll see what we can do with this. Okay. So the first part for those of those who don't know who Jorge Luis Borges is, I hope that this talk piques your interest in starting to read more of his writings. So he's from Argentina, and being born and raised in Argentina, I always read about how great Borges was and how admired he was throughout the world. And I always thought, well, maybe it's because I think I'm from Argentina and everybody thinks that way. So, but then moving to the US and having sometimes people tell me, oh, you're from Argentina, and not telling me, oh, Messi or Maradona, but Borges, tells me, well, maybe he is as great as everybody says he is in Argentina. But he was born in Argentina. He had very strong influence from his mother from in English and the English literature. He was raised bilingual, and then he moved in Europe, like around Europe, and lived in different countries, Switzerland, also in Spain. And that shows that he's that multicultural influence, being born and raised in Argentina, but also having a strong influence from European culture. And he was a writer. And it's hard to define what type of writer Borges is, right? But because he was a poet, but also wrote a lot of essays, a lot of interesting essays and short fiction, which I think is the thing that to me that makes him stand out by far. But he's also a translator, something that we might not discuss in depth. I was telling Mattia and Galina that I started with one idea, but honestly, this could be like five topics, and one of them could be Borges and translation. I think one of the things that I always found interesting about Borges is that he didn't consider himself a good writer, even though he's a fantastic writer, but a good reader, and you can see that through his writing. It's the type of writer that once you start reading it, in order to understand it, you have to go to another reference and understand what is he's referring to. And I think that's one of the best ways of writing, like expanding your world, expands your world in that way, in that sense. So he has a very particular way of writing. I think very concise, to the point. There's no extra words. He doesn't beat around the bush, and I think that makes him wonderful. Sorry, let me see if I can move. So one of the things that it's hard to describe Borges in what type of what is he's writing, but I think I like to think about it as more speculative fiction, and I think that's what I at least stands out for me, Borges, thinking about a topic, taking it to the extreme and putting that in the context of fiction. And with that method, he's able to touch a lot of different topics, a lot of interesting topics, mainly through his fiction, but also a lot through his essays and also his poems as well. He talks, and this is just some things that stand out to me, but I'm sure that the other topics. So thinking about the nature of time, the nature of reality, mathematics. There are books on Borges and mathematics, Argentine culture, and philosophy. You can see he discusses Kant, Hume, Locke throughout multiple of his writings, and language. I would say that language is the one thing that probably the primary topic that you see throughout Borges's writing. His first book is called The Language of the Argentine, right? El idioma de los argentinos, and he starts with that discussion, and you can see that topic throughout not only his essays but also his fiction. One thing that I think I'm important highlighting is he has multiple influences, but one of them is Fritz Mauthner. So, and for those of you who don't know who this Fritz Mauthner is, was an Austrian writer and philosopher, and one of the things that he was one of the first one to elaborate on the limitations of language as a tool to describe reality, and Borges always and if you see in fictions, he mentions as one of the authors he reads and rereads, and also he's one of the first ones to postulate that all philosophical problems are problems of language. Maybe he's not as well known as other philosophers, but a lot of the works of Wittgenstein come as a response to Mauthner. So he might not be as well known, but he obviously started some of the discussions that led to the important philosophical works of Ludwig Wittgenstein. So let's get to it, and what I'm going to try to do is, by using some of the texts from Borges, to show how some of them touch on certain topics or aspects of language. For those of you who have not read them, I'm going to try to give a brief summary, probably not doing justice to the whole content of it, but I'll try my best. So in the Aleph, the first story we're going to talk about, basically the plot is that Borges has an acquaintance who's a relative of beloved of his that recently passed, and that acquaintance is in touch with Borges, and he's trying to write a poem that describes all the universe in great detail. And one of the things that I want to highlight, if you read this, is Borges has a great sense of humor, and you can tell that he doesn't like what this person is writing. But he still goes because of the relationship he had with his recently deceased beloved. And one day, the person calls him and he tells him that his house is about to be torn down. So Borges rushes there and he invites Borges to see the Aleph. And this Aleph is the source of inspiration to this poem. And Borges sees it and he describes the Aleph as a point in space that contains all points and contains all the universe all at the same time. He's able to see everything, every part of the universe all at the same time. And obviously, in a very Borges way, he tries to describe what he sees. And here, one of the things that he writes, I think it's one of the lines or my favorite lines in literature, and that made me think about language. So here it says, I arrive now to the ineffable core of my story, and here begins my despair as a writer. All language is a set of symbols who use, whose use among its speakers assumes a shared past. How then can I translate into words the limitless Aleph, which my floundering mind can scarcely encompass? And here, and I had read this word multiple times, and I think until I started thinking more about what I'm presenting today, I never captured how much information and how many concepts are included in this. And then we're going to try to break them down a little bit, okay? So the first thing is that all language is a set of symbols. And what I'm showing below is a diagram like representing one Roman Jakobson's, who was also a philosopher that early in the 20th century tried to define the use of language. And one of them is the code, right? Talking about the code, the language itself. And here, what Borges first says, and which is obvious to all of us, is all language is a set of symbols. So let's talk about those set of symbols. What are the tools that language uses? And here I want to refer to another writing by Borges that you're all probably familiar with. That's called the Library of Babel. And here Borges describes a library where each wall has 5 shelves. Each shelf contains 32 books. Each book 410 pages. Each page for 40 lines. Each line has 80 symbols, and each symbol 25 variants. So 22 letters, a period, a comma, and a space, right? So if you think about it, that gives you an idea that just by developing this code and combining it, there's a lot of things that you can achieve, right? The combinations are endless. And some of you probably have heard about this experiment of putting monkeys in a typewriter and see how long it takes for someone recite something that resembles Shakespeare, right? And I tried to say, okay, how many books would that be? Would that be? And apparently there's no calculators that can calculate this, and I found this in Wikipedia, and so it must be legit. And so doing those calculations, you can see that it's 10, like 1,956 to the 10, and a lot of numbers after that. And just to give you a comparison of how many books would that be compared to how many grains of sand are in the earth and how many stars are calculated to be in the universe, you can see that it's way, way, way more. So thinking about language as a code that allows us that with different combinations and no, almost infinite combinations, the amount of knowledge and understanding that we can develop, right? And I thought, well, preparing for this talk, I found this website that I thought was interesting, where actually you can then like say, I want this book from this library, from this, and it gives you like what the combination of words would that be, and you can say this is the first word, the first page from the first book, from the first shelf, and this is what I see, and one random one that's in the, I don't know how, one wing, you can see that the title is things I need to know, but the rest is unintelligible. So maybe there's a code there of something that is really relevant. In this Library of Babel, you can imagine that we can find that paper that you want to write, that letter that you want to write to your beloved one, that thing that you never dare to say, the story of your life, the story of your life with someone else's name. So and that's I think the beauty of thinking about how this tool that we have, that's language, can with this with the possibility of combinations create something, right? And here in the Library of Babel, Borges discusses this based on an alphabet, right? Based in Spanish, where we use different symbols that together can represent sounds, but that's not the only tool that we can use to use for language, right? In Chinese, it's not so much based on the sounds itself, but more on ideograms. So that give us an either like higher possibility of combining things, right? Because there's endless combinations in space. So it's that, and this is just one way of thinking about it from an alphabet perspective. And that ability to form words, we see that every day in clinic, and we see that in our life, right? Where we have a concept where we can combine things from two words. And here I put an example of hematology. So the study of blood, or think about something intravenous, where we can combine two meanings to make a different one. And but sometimes we don't even need to resort to things that already have a meaning, and we can invent words out of nowhere. And here I put some examples that I found, right? That it doesn't necessarily need to have some like a past or an etymological root. And even Borges, and this is briefly just to mention, Borges throughout in another short story that I highly recommend, that's called Tlon Uqbar and Orbis Tertius, where he discusses the existence of an encyclopedia that describes a different type of world. He mentions that there are two types of languages, and you can see that they're very different to our language, right? A different concept, something that we would never imagine, like one that lacks nouns and it's centered on impersonal verbs. And the way to describe the moon rose above the water, you say upward behind the onstreaming, it mooned. So it without any nouns, something that would be totally different to fathom for us. And in another language, basically they don't there's no verb, but there are adjectives. So again, that also tells us that the way we have a certain code, a certain way of thinking about language, but it's not that that's the only way it could be. So we talk about the code, and we talk about almost limitless possibilities of what that code can do, right? But I think there's another part of this passage that is very revealing to us. It says, "How then can I translate into words the limitless Aleph, which my floundering mind can scarcely encompass?" And this is the part that I think is one of the things that is important, right? Because it's not about the code itself. It's not that the language is limited in this case, that's limiting Borges from being able to describe everything that he sees in the Aleph, but his inability to encompass all of that. And that's brings us to one of the points that I think it's important. I think it's important to discuss about is that language is not really a tool to describe reality, because this will sound pretty obvious, because this is what we see in the Aleph. We cannot perceive our reality for different reasons, because our senses are limited, and as I'm showing there in the visual spectrum, there's only a small range of electromagnetic waves that our eyes are able to perceive as light. And also we're able to focus our attention on certain things at a certain time. We cannot see everything, all of it at the same time. So that is one of the things that at least in the LF, it makes us think that's one of the main limitations for Borges to be unable to describe what he sees there in the LF, his inability to perceive it all. And if you think about that, but when we discussed with the Library of Babel, you can say, well, if he had the ability to perceive it all at the same time and with exquisite detail, he would be able to communicate that. So Borges provides us another thought experiment for this, and so this is basically what I want to show, so that we think about reality as a line. Our perception only can perceive part of it, and then with language, we make that even smaller. So we're able to perceive the whole reality, and language only makes that representation smaller. And we'll talk a little more about that. But going back to what I was saying, if we can think, well, if we had the ability to perceive it all and at the same time, then we might be able to communicate that. And there's another story by Borges that makes us think about that and puts and gives us a good thought experiment of what that might be. In this case, he described in Funes de Memorious, which is something that's often cited in the medical literature. Borges describes a Uruguayan that after a horseback riding accident, like has the ability to perceive everything in full detail and remember it all. So his memory was already good to begin with, and when he falls, apparently he becomes someone who's has the ability to perceive everything in full detail. And he remembers, and he gives examples in beautiful prose that this person is remembers, for example, the shape of the clouds at all given moments, as well as the associated perceptions of each moment. So Borges meets him, and this person describes multiple things and also some projects that he has. The first one is a new project for a new system for enumeration. So he develops a system that gives every numeral, at least until 24,000, its own arbitrary name because he doesn't see the sense of having he thinks that the decimal system doesn't make too much sense because it's too repetitive. And so he gives examples that in place of 7,013, he would say Maximo Perez, and in place of 7,014, the railroad. And on top of that, he also proposes a new system for language, right? In which each individual thing, each stone, bird, each branch would have its own name. It relates to what Locke at one point had proposed. And Funes proposed that, like, once projected an analogous language, but he discarded because he said that it seemed to him too general, too ambiguous. And by this, he says that the dog that he sees, he could not understand how the dog he saw at 3:15 was the same dog that he saw at 3:20, thinking that it did not take into consideration time. So that's again one of the things that Borges, at least in this story, tells us that that ability to perceive it all also comes with a problem, with a curse, and that ability to perceive everything at the same time leaves us with an inability to generalize, right? And I think that's something that is important not only from a memory but from a language perspective. In order to understand something, to look at it, we need to take a step back. We cannot have it like at the same it cannot be in our face. So we need to take a step back. Um, we know that in order to learn and to understand something, we need to forget a certain part. Uh, and in this with this story, Borges gives us a very important insight that all thought, including language, is formed by understanding relationships, right? So we cannot understand something without comparing to something else. I don't know you don't know what red is if the only thing you saw in your life was red. It's red because in comparison to something else, it's in contrast to something else. So if it's all present, if it's all visible to you all at the same time, it's difficult to compare. But also more important is that I'm sure that you thought about this when I was describing the the systems, is that it's very difficult to communicate with others, right? So this system of enumeration, it's so random that you have to learn something else. And I think that's one of the things that we see is relevant to what Borges is showing us in Funes de Memorias. Again, we have resolved the problem of being able to perceive things, but language we're still unable to communicate. And I think that's one of the points that brings up here in another part of this paragraph. So all language is a set of symbols, which we discussed, whose use among its speakers assumes a shared past. So in order to communicate, you have to take into consideration the other person, right? You have to know what the other person knows and doesn't know. You have that's shared past. So just being able to perceive and coming up with a word by yourself, no one else is going to understand, and is useless. So I'll give this example. If someone tells me they're getting a car, I can understand what it is. I may not know what car they're getting, if it's an old car, a new car, but I know what the car is. But if someone starts describing that they're getting a Mac MR 688P with an engine Mac E7 300, I have no idea what they're getting. I won't even know it's a car because even though they gave me more information, more detail, because I don't know anything about cars, and the people in the audience that know me know that I know nothing about cars. That information for misuse is it's more information, yes, but if you don't take into consideration the receiver, then that communication fails. And I think this is also a good example. It's trying to in this to the right, you're going to see different types of naming of systems to name kingship. So, for example, in Hawaiian, uh, you call your brothers and your sisters the same way you would call your cousins. Where in Sudanese kinship, they're more specific, and that comes with a trade-off, right? So, with when you communicate with others, you might leave some room for ambiguity, but on the other hand, you make communication more efficiently. Being too precise requires requires more cognitive knowledge, more learning, more words, right? We see that we see that in Chinese, right, where there's the ideograms, you have to learn them, and it maybe it makes Chinese one of the most difficult languages to learn. And so now we have understood that there is a trade-off, right? That idea of a perfect language that describes everything is almost impossible, right? Because even if we all had the capacity of full memory, we would, as time goes by, we would have to learn something new every second, right? Because time goes by. So then we think, well, language, there has to be a trade-off between things that other people can understand and learn, and also provides sufficient information that is not ambiguous in important situations. And this is where this essay on the analytical language of John Wilkins becomes important, because here Borges describes the proposal of an analytical language by John Wilkins, and that basically his attempt to decompose the entire universe of things and notions into smaller divisions, subdivisions, and by assigning to each step the decomposition of a syllable, a consonant, or a vowel. But mainly the point here, after the discussion and during the essay, is that this is a futile. This is futile because, again, of some of the things that I discussed before, but also points out that language itself is arbitrary. And he gives an example that those of us who are in the movement disorders field probably have heard of it multiple times, which is the classification of animals. And he cites like an apocryph encyclopedia, like the Celestial Emporium of Benevolent Knowledge. And the way they classify animals is, as you can see, those that belong to the emperor, embalmed ones, those that are trained, suckling pigs, mermaids, so categories that don't make any sense. Obviously, this is an extreme, and that's what Borges does with his literature. He takes a concept to an extreme to show us to show us a point of something that happens in our lives. But we see this in clinical practice. I see people that have neurodegenerative disorders, and sometimes it's very difficult to help people understand how we're classifying things. What do we mean? Do you mean I have dementia? Do you mean I have Alzheimer's disease? Can I have both? If I have dementia, does it mean that I have Alzheimer's disease? I have primary progressive aphasia. And we see that because what are those concepts grounded on is not entirely clear. And so I think that shows us that our language is sometimes very arbitrary. And so I think it's something important to take it into consideration. And that arbitrariness of language comes because we need to communicate with others. And to communicate, you have to find a common ground. And to find a common ground, you have to see what other people are noticing. So what other people to say, if you're pointing at something, there's a fire and you're pointing at it, everybody knows that you're going to be pointing at a fire. They're not going to assume that you're pointing to, I don't know, a small bird that's flying. So understanding that it's like sharing that common ground and understanding what are the salient features that we all understand is one of the parts of language. And again, as I write there, the word's function is not to convey details of a mental image, but to provide a useful landmark for us to coordinate around. Okay, so that language focuses on salient features. This is something that I think it's an interesting experiment, right? Thinking that maybe it isn't all random. And if I had to ask you which figure you would call Kiki and which one you would call Booba, just one thing made you think about it. So most people would call the pointy one Kiki and the more rounded one Booba. thinking that maybe there's an association between that the sound and the figure. And again, it goes back to the idea that we're looking at the salient features here. We're not focusing on they're black or not. They're focusing on what shape they have and what makes one figure different from the other. And this is known as the Kiki Bouba effect, thinking that maybe the words that we assign, even though we think that the word has nothing to do with the object itself, is not that arbitrary. I found it interesting that a lot of words that refer to the nose in different languages have some sort of a nasal sound, right? So nariz in Spanish or nose, and so I find that interesting thinking that there might be, even though we think about the word and the object as independent, there might be something that ties them and connects them. Um, and what we find considered salient varies depending on the culture, and that has brought some thoughts on language that can determine thought or it can influence thought. We think about that as linguistic relativism versus determinism, um, and you probably have read about or heard about like being that languages that have different types of way of describing blue maybe are more able to distinguish one or the other. That the Eskimos apparently have 50 ways of describing snow, which I read that that's not really true. Um, but if you think about it, right, if you think of that uh, language that determines thought, or what's called as the Sapir-Whorf theory, we know that it's not true, right? We saw that in the first text by Borges in the Aleph, that because he's able to see it, but he cannot describe it. And I think we all have had the situation, particularly those of us who are able who have moved to another country, have to speak a different language, that sometimes there are certain things that don't fall in one language or the other, or in daily life, right? Some things that they tell you, how are you? Are you sad? And you say, well, maybe sad is not the right word. I cannot find the word. So that tells you that language definitely doesn't determine thought, but it can influence it. And I think this is a very interesting paper for those by Irina Fedorenko thinking about that, right? That even though language is a language can affect thought, it's mainly a tool for communication. And I think that's something that throughout the discussion, I'm more closer to thinking it as true. But even though language it doesn't determine thought, or thought is not determined by language, it can it can affect thought. And I think that that's one of the things that we have to think about, and Borges points out as well. Because if you think about it, we talked about when we communicate with others, we point to salient features. We point to things that that everybody can convey around and say, oh, we can agree upon. But by pointing to certain salient features, obviously we miss the details. We focus on certain things that we all agree upon. So that leads us um, to missing some information, right? And by doing that, we shine a light on the things that we think are important. So and then that's the way language can play with your thought, right? By using certain words, it can make you focus on certain thoughts, right? On certain aspects of the thought. And so for example, if I say that the picture on the right is an old lady, and I want you to focus on the lower part and see a nose, you're gonna see that. But if I say it's a young lady, you may see that as a young lady turning her head. And the truth is that we have a lot of thoughts and ideas that we hold true that sometimes are contradicting, and depending on how the question is framed, or how the statement is framed, we might favor one or the other. And I think a good example of that is freedom of speech and avoiding violence. We'll all agree that those two are important, right? But depending on how we describe a situation, we might prioritize one or the other. Okay, and I think that that's one of the things that it's important about language. By focusing on a landmark, on a common ground that we all agree, it kind of leaves away certain details that might be important in certain situations. But also it can, by simplifying that, it can affect our memories. And I think this a good example of an experiment that was done by Carmichael in 1932, where he showed a group of people the pictures on the right, and to one group he showed the picture with the description of curtains in a window and the other one diamond in a rectangle. So, and you can see crescent moon, letter C, eyeglasses and dumbbells. And then uh, he or she, I don't know what Carmichael was, asked them to draw them again. And depending on on what word was ascribed to the figure, it was drawn in a different way. So that way, because when we remember things, we only remember we use words. We may use words to remember things. That strips away some of the details, and that can affect our memory, right? So, and that's why going with this is not the purpose of this talk, but thinking about Proust, right? That the idea that every time we remember something, we're forming that memory again, and that's why language can be so important and so relevant. And I think it's important to take that into consideration. And we see that in patients, right? When sometimes the narrative that they have to themselves may affect the way they remember things, and I think it happens to all of us, even if we're a patient or not. Um, and going back to medicine, this is important for medical terminology. Those of us who deal with functional movement disorders, we see this quite often in the clinic of should we call this? Should we call it a function? I mean, is it a functional disorder? There's a lot of things that we see that affect function, right? It's psychogenic. Maybe it's not a good idea because it focuses on on the psychiatric part, and it conveys the wrong message, right? Conversion, what is it converting from? Or non-organic, what does it mean? And I think this is a good paper by John Stone and Alan Carson where they say, why are we calling it non-organic? It doesn't mean anything. And that part of language where it focuses on a certain aspect in medicine can have its consequences. I'm not talking about being politically correct but you have to think about the consequences of you have to think about how the word itself may lead you towards one thought and make you pay less attention to another one. And this is one of the things, as I was saying before, one of the ways we use language as a tool, because even though the code is infinite and we have an ability to learn it all, one way is obviously pointing at landmarks, seeing that what is relevant, and the other one is by something that's pretty obvious through Borges literature, right? Library of Babel, the Book of Sand, Circular Ruins, the use of metaphor. Borges used that a lot. Borges was part of a movement that was called the ultraism, that thought about metaphor as the one figure that should be used and explored. And I think that that's one of the ways we think about, and we try to understand the world. Maybe we don't have words for everything, but by transferring the meaning of one word to another, we create new images, right? And a metaphor, I think, interestingly enough, is a metaphor by itself, right? Because it's carry across. So carry across the meaning from one word to the other. Like in this picture where I'm trying to show, like opening your mind. It's a metaphor, right? There's no such thing as really to open one's mind. It's a metaphor, and we see that a lot in medicine. And we use that a lot. So declining health, fighting cancer, a long road to recovery, like an ice pick pain, losing your memory. You're not losing anything, right? Senile dementia, and thinking about syphilis as even depending on what side you're from, of morbo gallico or morbo italico. So we use that a lot. And again, with the same, I think that's important to think about the same concept as I mentioned before, that by focusing or highlighting certain aspects of it, we may be missing other things that are important. So the other thing that so far, one of the things the main things that we're talking about is about words and the message that they're trying to convey, right? The words by itself. But we know that the words themselves are not the only part of the message, and that the message can change depending on who's telling you something, right? If someone I've seen patients that may tell you, I'm doing okay, and you say, that's fine. And some people tell you, I'm okay, and you worry. Or the other way around. Some people may tell you, oh, this is much worse, and you freak out. And some people may tell you, oh, it's worse, and you want to get more information because this is the fifth time that they tell you they're getting worse. And this is very elegantly shown in Pierre Menard, the author of the Quixote, which basically describes the effort of Pierre Menard to translate the Quixote. He is a big fan of Quixote and he wants to um, translate it. And by doing this, he wants to get himself in this. He wants to be Cervantes himself, and he wants to learn Spanish and know what Cervantes knew. But he decides that this is not interesting enough, and that it's much better if he translates the Quixote through himself, through his experience. And what's beautiful about this text is that the translation is exactly the same, but the meaning is completely different because the messenger is different. And I'm just going to show you brief part of this. So he says, history, the mother of truth. The idea is staggering. Menard, a contemporary of William James, defines history not as delving into reality, but as the very font of reality. Historical truth for Menard is not what happened, it is what we believed happened, what we believe happened. The final phrases, exemplar and an advisor to the present and the future counselor, are brazenly pragmatic. So the same thing, the same translation, but completely different meaning because the person who's telling you the story, this, even though the words, the code, it's the same, comes from a completely different context. And I think it's a very fun story to read. And we think about this. We see this every day, right? Homonyms and where the context may change, right? Nail and bad are good examples, and how the same word, depending on where it's written. If you read Tolkien, you find that the words that may have a different meaning nowadays, and I think gay is a good example of that. So depending on what context the message is being delivered, that changes the message itself. And it brings me back to a last point that I think it's important, that sometimes the message itself, it doesn't tell us so much about informing us about the world, but it tells us more about the person itself and how that can change the message. So, for example, there's an example of what's called Russell's conjugation. So, saying that I'm firm, but you are obstinate and they are pig-headed. So, the same thing can be the same quality depending on who you're talking about, or how much you like that person, or how much that person likes you, can have a different adjective. And I think this is always always very fun to see Tom Gold thinking about describing the same thing but in a totally different context and how you use different words. So it doesn't tell us too much about the reality itself, but the appreciation of the person of reality. So these are some final thoughts. Think of when I first thought about this years ago, thinking about, well, as a clinician, there's a way that I can get better at describing things, that there's an ability to translate that thought and translate that reality into language, but really it's about communication. I think thinking more about language as a means of communication, which will be imperfect, and trying to make it better and precise comes with its trade-offs, right? Because we can make up words that say that something precisely, but if no one else knows them and it takes too long to learn it, like, then it's a moot point. And the way we do this, this is one of the things that I find interesting and Attendees work is by identifying salient features, right? Saying what is the thing that these things that it's going to call the attention to someone else, and finding that common ground, and creating images with known words, like what we see in metaphors. But this comes with trade-offs, right? We talked about the trade-offs about simplification and overlooking important features. And finally, that the words are not the only ones conveying the message, but the context itself, where you have those words, also are important to that meaning. So these are other. I thought we include there's way more about Borges and language and lots of people that have that wrote about it. So these are other pieces of fiction and essays that discuss things about language, and other books, some which I resorted to while preparing for this, that I think are interesting. So I hope that I piqued your interest in Borges and language, and thank you very much for having me and listening. I'll stop sharing.
Right. Thank you, Dr. Thank you, Dr. Rodriguez-Porcel, for such an amazing and really thoughtful webinar. So the floor is now open for questions and answer. Feel free to put it in the chat or raise your hands if you have any questions. Um, Yeah, I'm really interested in kind of this like language topic because as English is my second language, so I just speak Burmese in my whole life, and I just got here around like 2022, 2023. And I still remember the first time I got here. I don't know like how to answer just to a simple questions. Hey, how are you doing? Everybody is say like, hey, how are you doing? I don't know what to answer. Like, do I have to say what I'm going to do, or do I have to say like, how am I feeling? I just smile back, and I'm really shy to talk, and I have a lot of anxiety and depression. I don't know how to explain like in the second language. So yeah, with my experience, I think you just have to go and talk to people. You just need time and experience um to be able to communicate in another language. So Dr. Rodriguez, do you also have any experience that you want to share, like when you first?
All my life, yeah. And I think it goes back to the idea of that when you communicate with someone, you to some extent you assume that there's a common knowledge, right? And that might not always be clear. And it goes back to the idea that we use a lot of metaphors to when we express ourselves. So as someone, I completely understand that where you learn the words and you know that each word means something, and someone's puts in a combination that you never heard before, you're gonna go, okay, word by word, this is what it means. And then they look at you funny, and that's okay. And you learn, and I think that's part of it. Yeah, so yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Oh, we have one question. Please go ahead, Dr. Corey Polonsky.
Hi, Dr. Sorsel. Thank you so much.
Jorge,
It's so good to see you. Thank you so much for this talk. This was amazing, as always. One of the things I was thinking about was the importance of context, I think came up multiple times, and that's something like it really grounds the meaning where it's so funny to think about it as it's all just meaningless symbols without any context to put it in. I think when you were talking about, I think it was Fune's the Memorious, when you were talking about how it kind of made me think of simultaneous nausea too, almost when like with images, right? Where it's like he could see all the very detailed bits of language and knew and could like create those things and focus in on them, but he couldn't see the important part of like this is how you function in the world. Like if you focus too much on the features of these individual tiny little things, like yes, you're correct. That's what you're seeing,
yeah.
but you're incapable of function. I don't know what you think about from that
No,
standpoint.
that's a fantastic point. I think that I think it goes beyond the language itself.
Yeah.
It's about like understanding reality, right? So
Hmm.
if we, as I was saying there, if all you see is red, you cannot compare things. To
Yeah.
understand something, you have to be able to relate it to something else. And that's also where the metaphors come.
Hmm.
Because in the end, what we're doing is using something to compare it. Um, and it goes, I mean, go and think about physics, right? The Heisenberg principle, where you cannot understand the position and the charge of an electron at the same time. You have to, there's a trade-off. You can understand one or the other.
Yes.
And when thinking about language is that abstraction and that abstraction of thought,
Mhm.
because you have to be able to see the bigger picture. I mean, we all seen this cartoon of people touching an elephant and describing
Yeah,
different
exactly.
things,
Uh-huh.
right? The thing is, and it's this part of the challenge is like uh, there's no clear delimitation of what's the right how far you should zoom out, right?
Mhm,
So
exactly. Yes.
because
And you can go too far out
you
and
go
then
too far as well,
not see.
right?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
So that's the part where, and sometimes we see that in medicine, right?
Mhm.
We can think about the whole problem and we say, I don't know, the articulation is impaired, but we forget to see, well, the articulation may be impaired, but if are they able to speak? Are they able to communicate?
Yes.
So sometimes being too granular comes with its problems. So that's what it keeps this interesting. You can always make an argument you should be a little more precise or take a step back, depending on what serves your purpose of what that you want to do.
100%. No, thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you. Mattia, please go ahead.
Yeah, no, this was just masterful. You know my love for Borges, and this was just beautiful. And I'll ask you a little bit of a meta question because I think you outlined how Borges, in his writing, in his fictions, really gave descriptions to things that we see in the clinic or things that we see in life. And I almost think at the start, almost how his use of language sort of gave us an idea of how LLMs would come into being in some way. So what I've been really thinking about and we've been really reflecting on is um, reading works of fiction as a way to then understand more about our world, more about neuroscience, more about psychiatry, more about psychology, and really finding the instinct that authors really have, and I think they still have, and I think it's still a very vital area for then reflection on how our world and our brains work.
So the way I think about this is all of us that go in. I mean, I see there's a lot of physicians there. So that go into medicine, we think about science a lot, right? And I think science is a good method to understand the world. But what science really does, it helps us to understand if what we're hypothesizing, so a hypothesis, is close to reality or not, how likely that is. But it doesn't give us the possibilities of what the world could be. And that's where fiction comes in. So, and I think, and that we see that there's a book that I think I told you about. Proust was a neuroscientist with, and I put that in one of the lists where it shows examples of how works of fiction preceded scientific knowledge by centuries, like thinking about what I mentioned about Proust and the idea that every time we remember something, we're reforming that memory again, and that's a work of fiction that had nothing to do with it was not based on scientific knowledge. It was mainly on a perception or on a thought. The same things go to some extent with Fluency Memorious and the case described by Alexander Luria, right? The idea of about perfect memory. So Borges imagined this without necessarily knowing about the case at the time. Um, and that's where the ability of language allows us to think about what it could be possible, what is possible. Then science will help us understand if it is or not. It will tell us yes, no, likely or not likely. But I think that's where I think about that fiction can help us understand this. And that's why, because not all studies have been done, this idea we're talking about with Mattia and Galina that it gives you such a different perspective when you practice, because there's not everything has gone through a clinical trial, and but in the end, when you see a patient, it helps you to understand that part of the world.
Thank you. There is a question in the chat. He is saying, I guess this is a sign that I'm getting older, but I wanted to get your perspective on generation and new terminology, things for which we have words, and we understand what they mean, are constantly being renamed by newer generations. So is there a need for new words, or how do you explain this pattern?
Cool. That again, I'm a simple neurologist, but and I see this with my children, thinking about the use of new words. Again, goes back to the idea that in the end there's no authority, particularly in English, there's no authority on language. Language evolves constantly, and what language is how you use it. So in Spanish where we have an academy that kind of dictates some of the norms, but still the language, the way it's used, it has to do with basically our inability that we're not that even though we may argue that we're pre-configured for language, what the language looks like is different in each brain, and it depends on the use. I get that also with my kids that there are certain words that mean something completely different, even in English. So yeah, I think that is an interesting explanation to it.
Yeah, there's another one who he is also saying, I do have a very similar question underlying socio-linguistic and cognitive mechanisms that drive each generation to develop new terminology for established concepts.
So yeah, I think also it depends on what you highlight at the moment, right? So this goes back to the idea of culture to some extent shaping language. If I don't know how can I say that I like football, right? So the real football, not the American football. I like real football, so I can tell you. To me, if someone plays, it's not the same thing if they're a goalkeeper than if they're a striker than if they play in the midfield. But if you tell me something regarding I don't know, American football, like they're a player, I have no idea what that is. So it depends on what you're giving importance to it. I'll just give you an example. My son is 13, and apparently all the kids now e-bikes are their thing. So they know everything about e-bikes, and they can have different descriptions of what is to me an e-bike is an e-bike, and that different terminology. That's where it arises, and sometimes it kind of captures words that are already in use, because again, developing a new vocabulary, a new word, it has to be a good reason, or it has to have by chance. Again, this is all things that I think I'm no authority on this. You're asking me and I'm answering.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Rodriguez. So if you we don't have any more questions. Well, I'm truly amazed that we are meaning to learn about Borges in a busy school night for illuminating my words a little bit more. Thank you, Dr. Rodriguez. We are almost time right now. If you still have questions, you can send us email or just reach out to us anytime. We are happy to answer your questions. We have an amazing plan from our Neurohumanity Network. So it's Thanksgiving, it's coming year. So we have a contest where you can submit any art or work in any medium to express your gratitude for this season. And you can email us before November 30. And you will be entered into a raffle to win a gift card. So we are all excited for that. And then we have next month's seminar with amazing Dr. Corey Polonsky. She is also here joining us right now. She will be saying on topic on joy and the brain. So please join us on December 9th. And I hope we'll see you there.
It's a tough act to follow, let me tell you. Thank you so much for this. This is awesome.
Gonna be better. If you like this one, you're gonna like Corey's better. So
no.
And on just a final note, we also have a second booster session. Music therapy and holiday carols just came in today, but Cassandra Mulcahy and Chris Gummerson will be giving us this booster session for the holidays. We don't have a date yet, but stay tuned for a date mid-December. And thank you so much, Dr. Rodriguez-Porcel, for a wonderful talk.
Thank you for having me and for listening.
Have a good night, everyone.